Good morning. Today is April 3rd, 2021. We are doing our monthly Zazenkai on Zoom. To start, I want to thank so many of you coming to spend a day in meditation together. It's wonderful to see. It's very inspiring and encouraging that you chose to spend this day in meditation and mindfulness practice. This Dharma talk for today, I'm going to kind of try to continue with what we have been discussing so far this year, and I will do a brief overview to catch us up and to remind you. But I also want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk today about this a relationship between mindfulness practice and meditation practice and how it fits together. So if you recall, the first Teisho we did back in January, we took up an old Buddhist sutra about a monk who had difficulty meditating, and he was giving some instructions on how to practice and what sort of things he needs to cultivate in order to be able to meditate. And then we continued the discussion. We talked about koan meditation as one particular type of meditation practice and how that fits with cultivation of wisdom and the intersection between Zen practice, meditation practice, koan practice, and the work in the Dokusan with the Zen Teisho. Finally, last month we talked about this need to communicate and how Zen is very suspicious of concepts, and somehow the very abstract nature of the conceptual realities we create and find ourselves in, and somehow not really satisfying when it comes to our understanding. It seems that we need a more living understanding, more understanding that can breathe, not just think, a more sort of embodied understanding. And how concepts, while they're essential to what we are as human beings, somehow just don't seem to be adequate for that. So this is where I would like to start today, with this idea of how Zen is suspicious of concepts, and to extend it a little bit further. And to say that Zen is not just suspicious about concepts because they somehow seem to be inadequate as a tool of communication and also the tool of understanding, but we are suspicious of them also because they're the main ways in which we deceive ourselves. Our thoughts and the emotions that arise are the main tools of self-deception. And this is also another reason why Zen is very suspicious of concepts. So I'm going to offer you some tools to start, and then also I will give you a few quotes to illustrate this. But it may seem a little bit overwhelming. So I want to, before I do that, there are two things I want to mention in terms of strategies, how we can deal with when we find ourselves in a challenging situation, or when we are overwhelmed and having a hard time coping. Specifically here, I'm talking about Zen practice. I know that now we are in a third wave of the pandemic. I think everything is getting shut down again, and some of you have had a difficult time. But I can't really talk directly to that because everyone's situation is different. And sometimes it's hard to generalize. But I could attempt to generalize, at least when it comes to Zen practice, from my own personal experience. And there are these two strategies that I always find very useful whenever I'm in a situation that seems to be difficult, or I'm having a hard time in my practice. And the one thing that always seems to work is to kind of slow down time a little bit, to become a bit more present, and just to focus on the work that can be done within 1 minute, let's say, or not even the whole meditation, 25 minutes, maybe just 5 minutes. I can certainly take care of that. I can take care of the next 5 minutes and then maybe next 5 minutes. So just to become a little bit more present, not to let the mind run so far away into the future, and try to slow down time a little bit, to enter into a different kind of time zone and to focus more on what is taking place right now. So this is one strategy that is always very useful. And another strategy is whenever we are having difficulties, it's to kind of take a long-term view of the path and to focus on compassion, to work on our intention, our motivation, to cultivate the bodhisattva spirit. If we can cultivate that sense of vastness of compassion, then whatever difficulty or struggle we are going through in this particular moment, it somehow seems small and insignificant and easy to deal with. So these are the two kind of things that are very, that I found very useful. So whenever you're having difficulties in your practice, Zen practice, meditation practice, wisdom practice, these are the kind of things that can be very helpful. So everything that I'm going to say today, I want you to, if you find it challenging, then you can use this as well, use these strategies. Again, try to become more present, just to take care of the next minute or 5 minutes, and then to cultivate a kind of bodhisattva spirit, to work on our intention. Whenever we have difficulties, just work on your intention. Try to cultivate that bodhisattva spirit, and you'll find things are not so difficult or not so unworkable. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a few quotes. And this is the first one. This is a Zen koan. It's a conversation between Isan and Kyozan. Now, you'll remember Kyozan and Isan, they founded the first school of Zen. In China, there were only 5 schools of Zen. And this was the first one. Isan was a student of Yakujo, and he founded his own monastery, and Kyozan was his main disciple. This is one conversation they had. So Isan asked Kyozan, of the 40 sections of the Nirvana Sutra, how many were spoken by Buddha and how many were spoken by demons? So Nirvana Sutra, there are 2 versions of Nirvana Sutra. There's Theravadan version, and this is kind of a little bit biological, not biological, I meant biographical. It describes the last 3 months of Shakyamuni Buddha's life. And then there's Mahayana version, which is kind of almost like an encyclopedia of Buddhism. It tries to include everything that was taught, to put all teachings under one roof, so to speak. So it has 40 chapters. It's a very long sutra. It's a collection, basically. So of the 40 sections of the Nirvana Sutra, how many were spoken by Buddha and how many were spoken by demons? And Kyozan said, all of them were spoken by demons. And Isan said, from this moment on, no one will be able to deceive you. And then the story continues. Kyozan asked him, Master, what should I do? How should I practice? And Isan said to him, I don't care what you do and how you practice. I'm simply admiring the clarity of your eye. So I'm just using this to illustrate how suspicious Zen is of all conceptual realities. But I'm not sure to what degree this koan is really helpful to us today, because we have to live in these conceptual realities that we are creating for ourselves. So I have two other additional quotes, and these are very beautiful. Dharmapada is one of my favorite Buddhist texts. It's a collection of sayings of Shakyamuni Buddha, which are put under different headings according to their subject matter. And sometimes the translations are rather literal and they miss the spirit of the teachings. And sometimes they're very poetic, and while they may not be exactly correct word for word, I think they're better. So this is one such translation, and this is the first chapter on choices and the very, very famous, the beginning of the Dharmapada. And this is Shakyamuni Buddha speaking. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with an impure mind, and trouble will follow you, as the wheel follows the ox that draws the cart. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with a pure mind, and happiness will follow you, as your own shadow, unshakable. So this is one quote, and I have one more. This is from a different chapter, the third chapter called Mind. Your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own thoughts, unguarded. But once mastered, no one can help you as much, not even your father or your mother. So these are my quotes for today that are hopefully going to illustrate some of the things I want to talk about. So what are we to do? What are we to do? The thoughts and emotions that arise in the mind are the only thing we have. It's the only thing we know. It's the only thing we can rely on. But those very same things are also what often, always drives our suffering. These thoughts and emotions are the very tools of our self-deception. So what can we do? What can we do? Well, there is one thing we can do. It seems like if the mind itself is the creator of our happiness and suffering, then the only thing we can do is awareness. We can practice awareness as a way of dealing directly, going directly to the source. And this is where mindfulness practice and meditation practice come together. And this is really what I want to talk about today. There is confusion about it because they both use awareness. So sometimes it seems like it's the same thing, mindfulness practice and meditation practice. And perhaps at a high level, it is the same. But for beginners like us, I think it helps to differentiate them. Because if we don't, what happens is we will neglect one side of things. If we think it's the same, then we will neglect one side of practice. But if we can differentiate it clearly, and in time, perhaps for high-level practitioners, they become one and the same. But I think for beginners, it helps to have a very clear understanding what they are and how to practice them. So you can think, I've been talking about what meditation practice is for the past 3 months. So let me say something about mindfulness and how it's different. Mindfulness, basically, you can think of it as paying attention, being aware of what is taking place right now in your field of perception, in the world around you, but also with our body, with our emotions, with the state of mind, with the content of our thinking. Basically, mindfulness is cultivation, a purposeful, disciplined way of cultivating self-awareness, being self-aware. And how can we call ourselves Zen practitioners, students of Zen, if we are not self-aware? This makes no sense to me at all, that somebody would practice Zen or try to practice Zen and not practice self-awareness. So this is a very basic practice. And in this day and age, words such as meditation and mindfulness, they have come into our collective vocabulary. There's nothing particularly exotic or strange or odd about them. They have become something of a buzzword. But I'm not sure to what degree they're really practiced, because by their very nature, the very nature of the mind, you cannot expect quick results. And in this day and age, we really, really have come to be reliant on quick results. If something doesn't produce result quickly, it's quickly discarded. So the true practice, or actually worthwhile, effective practice of mindfulness and meditation, it's something that we have to cultivate for a long time in order for it to be effective. So this kind of old-fashioned practice has become very old-fashioned. Zen in some way has been, it's old-fashioned these days. It's not this kind of slow practice or fundamental practice is not in fashion these days. But nevertheless, we'll try to do our best and to illustrate what it is. So practicing self-awareness, being self-aware of what is taking place right now. This is, in a nutshell, what it is. Moreover, it's a consistent, disciplined, structured way of doing it repeatedly over and over. So what sort of things can we pay attention to? What sort of things do we need to be aware of in our own minds? Well, this is something we can have a discussion on, actually. I think it would work better as a discussion. I can ask you and you can come up with many things. I think it would work wonderful in that way. But I just want to make a few little points that I find interesting. One is this idea of mixing Dharma with self-awareness. The idea is you're looking where, so the first question is, where do you look? Well, you look inside the mind, you look at the body, you look at the environment. But specifically, let's say you're looking at your thoughts, your own emotions. You're seeing how they arise, what is leading to this particular feeling, this particular sensation, this particular state of mind. You're seeing how it's how it's disappearing. You're looking how it's interacting with your other thoughts, what's leaning on what, and how things come about in the mind. But then when you begin to mix, the idea of mixing Dharma and awareness, self-awareness, is that it gives you a little bit better idea of where to look, and to look at the patterns and the relationships, and to have insight into what is taking place. It's a kind of, you can think of it as if you're walking through the woods with a naturalist, and they tell you, oh, there's a moth. They point out something. You see this moth growing here. This is because it's the north side of the tree or something. It's in the shade, so therefore you will find this moth here. And then you notice it and you see, oh yeah, this is true. It really does grow. And then you walk further along the path, and then you can find it yourself. So this idea of mixing Dharma and awareness is a way to help us notice things about ourselves. It's not to accept something as a fact, but to use it as a way of looking at yourself, at your own mind, and to notice things easier and find things easier about yourself. So it basically makes self-examination easier. It makes having realizations about the nature of our confusion, how it's coming about, and why are we reacting in a certain way. Why a certain kind of thoughts and feelings are arising, and how, and when they disappear, how they're disappearing. So this is just one point I wanted to make that maybe wouldn't spring to mind right away. But I think this is a really good topic for a discussion, because you have a wealth of experience yourselves, and we can talk about kind of things that we could be self-aware. Now, I have a second part of this talk. I'm going to talk about what is the relationship between mindfulness and meditation. But I do want to mention one thing. In Sangha Zen in particular, we don't put a lot of emphasis on mindfulness practice, unfortunately. And partially this is because in old Zen texts, which we study, it's not there. And the reason it's not there is because it's assumed that this is something that's practiced. In the same way that a moral discipline is assumed that it's practiced. It's not, it doesn't have to be spelled out because everyone's doing it. I'll just give you an illustration. In Japan, you have a tea ceremony it has developed as an art form. Basically came out of a Zen tradition. And I think maybe you watched it on TV or something, but everything is done very purposefully, very sharply, very precisely. All the movements of the bodies, the way you mix the tea, how you sit, even what your mental attitude is going in and receiving, and so on. This is basically all mindfulness. You are really fully being aware of your body posture, of your movements, of your mental attitude. So you can see art forms such as that can only arise in an environment where mindfulness practice, self-awareness is something that is really cultivated. But we don't put a lot of emphasis on it nowadays because we have forgotten that these things were just so ingrained in the practice of those days. And because they were not spelled out, we have forgotten them. So this is just a reminder. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the relationship of meditation practice and wisdom practice and mindfulness practice. So you can think of it, I tried to come up with another image. If you remember in the last Dharma talk, I was talking about meditation practice like a sail, unfurling a sail. So now for today, I came up with a little bit different image, and that's of a mind as a balloon, and the balloon that is drifting up in the sky, and it's being tossed about with the wind and the temperature in the environment, whether it's going up or falling down. So you can think of mindfulness practice as like a string that's going to tie that balloon down to something. This is the action, the function, the activity of your own self-awareness. You're tying it down. You're not just letting it be tossed about, you're tying it down. And now the question is, what are we tying it to? And this is where we can bring the meditation practice in. For somebody who is experienced with the Sambo Zen curriculum, we can say you tie down to Mu, which is, you're all familiar, but it's the first koan of Mumonkan, which is the koan that most people start working with. In other words, you're trying to not just tie down anywhere, but you're trying to tie down to the nature of mind, to the Buddha nature. You're tying your own mind down to the ground, and the ground is the vastness of compassion, let's call it, the emptiness. You tie down to Mu, you're tying down to emptiness itself. And what does that do when you're practicing in this way? When your mind is tied down, when it's grounded in Mu, when it's grounded in the essential world. What is the point of that? Well, remember how I said that the thoughts and emotions are the main tools of our self-deception. It's not that there is something evil about thoughts and emotions. Isan said, how many chapters were written by demons? It's not that there are demons. It's just that that balloon is always rooted to ignorance. It's always rooted to our own self of a sense of inadequacy, fear, anxiety. It's tied down to the sense of dissatisfaction. Whatever it is right now is somehow not enough. It's tied down to a certain kind of thirst. So of course, what is rising out of that ground, what we actually perceive, we don't perceive the ignorance itself. We don't perceive that unless we practice a lot of self-awareness. But it's hard to perceive that. What we do perceive are our thoughts and our emotions. You don't say to yourself, okay, I'm gonna feel this way right now, or I'm gonna have this thought. No, it's just the thought arises and then you have to react to it, or you have to listen to that thought. You hear that thought, you listen to it. Often without any regard for what that is all about. We're just simply reacting. We are listening. We are blind. We are servants of these thoughts and feelings. So in that sense, we are deceived. But if we can tie the mind to the essential world, what that does, it begins to shift. It begins to change. It cultivates the very nature of the mind, the very ground of the mind. And then what arises of that, out of that, instead of fear, what might arise is a sense of compassion or understanding. You may suddenly, the very thoughts that you're having, they're rooted in wisdom and compassion. Once the ground has been worked. And this is where meditation practice is really important. This is where mindfulness alone is not enough. We really need to begin to cultivate the ground from which thoughts and emotions, our perceptions, how we understand the world, how we relate to the world is transformed. And this is where understanding comes in. This is where cultivation of wisdom comes in. So that the very thoughts and the very emotions that are arising in the mind are rooted in wisdom and compassion. And this is where Shakyamuni Buddha says, it can become your greatest friend. It becomes your greatest asset. Your mind becomes it is your worst enemy, but it can also be your best friend. So in that sense, we need to understand the significance of meditation practice. And the significance of mindfulness practice, how the two are related, and how we need that string, but we also need to work on the ground. If the string is always going to be tied down to greed and anger and violence and dissatisfaction and anxiety, well, that's not going to help us very much unless we can somehow transform the very ground of the mind. And for that, we really need understanding. We need to go beyond the boundaries of our ordinary perception. We cannot allow our limited understanding to define our realities. And this is where meditation practice comes in. So the both are so important there. I always say they're complementary practice. They work together. And it's easier in a way. Mindfulness is easier. You can always begin to notice, begin to be a little bit more present. Even if we have no understanding of any kind, we can just begin to pay attention. And we can do that for 1 minute. We can do it for 5 minutes. If everything I said today seems overwhelming and difficult, it doesn't have to be, because we can manage it just for 1 minute. Let's just start there. Let's just start with the mindfulness for 1 minute, and then we can also work on our spirit, the bodhisattva spirit. Try to work from or function with this sense, this vastness of compassion, to see things with the eye of the vastness of compassion. And then all these little things, our preoccupations with the moment, our little self-deceptions, they just somehow are drowned out by that vast voice. So this would be my talk, my attempt to communicate to you something that I haven't heard. I haven't heard anyone teaching it in this way, especially in Sangha Zen tradition. I think it's really unfortunate that we don't talk about mindfulness practice. We don't talk about just paying attention. This is fundamental Zen thing. And this is something that we can really do. It's easy to do. You don't need to work with Mu is much more difficult, but to just begin to pay attention, it's easy. Anyone can do it. And maybe in this day and age, in which being distracted seems to be the solution for everything. Just give me more distraction. maybe mindfulness is the really the place where we have to start. And then the second point I'm making, we cannot stop there. We really have to meditate and meditate well, because what we really want is transform the ground of our being, so that the thoughts and the emotions and the vision that arises with that is rooted in compassion and wisdom. We cannot just stop. We're just paying attention like some mechanical clock or something. We really want for it to become, for the arising of generosity and loving kindness to become automatic to our minds. This is when the mind has really become well trained. So this is my talk for today. And now we will recite the four great vows, and we will continue with our Zazenkai.